chapter 7. And they get to Central Intelligence, they're on their way to Central Intelligence. And Charles Wallace Calvin says, I should go in first. You stay here with Meg, and I'll come back, case the joint, etc., come back and let you know. Charles Wallace, no. She told us to stay together. She told us not to go off by ourselves. Calvin, no, she told you not to go off by yourself. And that's true. She did say that. But they did also say you should all stay together. So, we're going to skip quite a bit. They go inside, and the guy at the desk mentions it, pages 130, 131. And let's see here. The wall that they were sitting at kind of disappears. Bottom 131, top of 132. And they look into a great big room full of machines. Now, again, this is 1959, 1960 when she's writing this, so, they were not unlike the great computing machines Meg had seen in her science books. What does she mean? She means like the old Univacs, where a single computer with about 2 megabytes of RAM would take up this entire room. Okay? Because bear in mind, if you're not aware of this, this has more computing power than all the computers NASA had when they sent men to the moon. You've got more computing power in this thing than everything NASA had, okay, at that time. Just kind of put things in a little perspective. So Calvin mutters something, middle of 132, and makes like, what did you say? Nothing to fear except fear itself. And he's scared stiff. She says, so am I. So they go in, and Charles Wallace, the three of them are holding hands. Charles Wallace, they go into this room, suddenly yells out, top of 133, don't let go of my hands. Hold me tight. He's trying to get at me. Meg, who? Is there a he there? They don't see anybody. I don't know, but he's trying to get in at me. I can feel him. So why don't Meg and Calvin feel him?
They're not like Charles Wallace.
They're not like Charles. Well, Calvin is. Calvin says, you're like me, sport. Meg's not one of us, we've been told. Okay? But not to the degree that Charles Wallace is. Calvin, let's go back. Just turn around, leave. Charles Wallace, no, I have to go on. Notice, he doesn't say we have to go on. I have to go on. We have to make decisions. We can't make them if they're based on fear. Right? You make decisions based on what? Reason, logic, not fear. They keep walking. They get to the end of the room, and there's a platform. On the platform was a chair. On the chair was a man. And the man has red eyes. And the man says, but not with his mouth, I've been waiting for you, my dears. Kind, gentle, soothing voice. And she realizes he's not talking, he's speaking directly into her mind. Charles Wallace says, Calvin came along for the ride, because the man says, I thought it would just be the two of you. How does it happen that there are three of you? Calvin's along for the ride. Oh, he did he? Charles Wallace says it's been very educational for Calvin. The man orders, let Calvin speak for himself. And Calvin does. I have nothing to say. That is, I don't want to talk to you. Meg stares at the man, horrified fascination. His eyes were bright, had a reddish glow. A light above his head, kind of like his eyes, red, pulsing. Charles Wallace tells Meg and Calvin, don't look at his eyes. He'll hypnotize you. Clever, aren't you? You see, top of the next page, what you will soon realize is there's no need to fight me. Not only is there no need, but you will not have the slightest desire to do so. For why should you wish to fight someone who is here only to save you pain and trouble? For you, as well as for the rest of all the happy, useful people on this planet, I, in my own strength, am willing to assume all the pain, all the responsibility, all the burdens of thought and decision. Because what comes as a result of thoughts and decisions? Pain, burdens, responsibility. That's why in the Harry Potter novels, when somebody gets put under an imperious curse, their immediate sensation is one of complete bliss. Why? Because they no longer think. Somebody else is thinking for them. Charles, we'll make our own decisions. Thank you, of course. And our decisions will be one, yours and mine. What does he mean?
That we'll make the same decisions together.
Exactly. Don't you see how much better, how much easier for you that is? Let me show you. Let's say the multiplication table. He starts and Charles Wallace says, no, think of something else. All right. So Meg says, 137. We're just trying to find our father. Can you tell us where to find him? Notice how she's dealing with this guy. Kind of like he could be helpful. In fact, she even says, if you please, we're just here looking for our father. Can you help us find him? He says, yes, your father. It's not can I, but will I? I mean, yes, of course I can. Well, will you then? Well, depends. Why do you want your father? She's like, well, that's a stupid question. What do you mean? Why do I? Didn't you ever have a father? You don't want him for a reason. You want him because he's your father. That is, this isn't logical. It's not logic for wanting a father. It's what? It's beyond logic.
It's emotional.
It's emotional. It's heart. But he hasn't been acting like a father, has he? Abandoning his wife and 4 little children. What? To go gallivanting off on wild adventures of his own? Meg, he was working for the government. That is, he wasn't off gallivanting. That's what people in the little town they live in say he was doing. They say he left Mrs. Murray for, as Calvin puts it, a dame. She says, we want to see him, please, right now, please. He says, oh, by the way, you don't need to talk with me. I can read your minds and such. Okay. Suddenly, Charles Wallace darts forward, page 138, and hits the man as hard as he can. Okay, he's 5 years old. Can't hit him real hard. Men in dark smocks move, and the guy says, hold it. Calvin says, hold it. The man gives a wince. Why did you do that? He asked Charles Wallace. Because you aren't you. In other words, Charles Wallace can sense what?
People's beings.
Okay. This guy's a puppet. There's a puppet master somewhere else. He's saying, I don't want to deal with you. I want to deal with your puppet master. I'm not sure what you are, but you aren't what's talking to us. I'm sorry if I hurt you. I didn't think you were real. I thought maybe you're a robot. But whatever it is, it's coming through you. Yeah, smart, aren't you? Charles, it's not that I'm smart. Try to find out who I am then. Charles, I have been trying. So what's Charles been doing?
Trying to get a read on this person.
Whatever he does with his brain, he's been sending it out. He's been trying to figure what this guy is. Look into my eyes. Look deep within them, and I will tell you. Charles looks at Meg and Calvin. Got to. Only way we're going to find Father is if I figure out who this guy is. Meg's like, no, Charles. But what happens? He looks, and as he looks, page 140, his eyes are no longer focusing, and his hand slips out of Meg's and Calvin's hands. And he starts walking toward the man in the chair. Meg screams no. She screams no, runs after him, and she tackles him. And after he's knocked out for a moment, he gets up, opens his eyes, shakes his head. His eyes that had been dilated, like when you go get your eyes checked, they put the drops in and they open up. His eyes now go back to normal. The man in the chair is not pleased with this. Okay? So, Bottom of 141. Charles Wallace says, when he offers them food and stuff, otherwise you're going to starve, they say no. Charles Wallace says, let's get on with it. He says, that's what we were doing until your sister interrupted. 142. Meg, no, Charles, please, let me do it. Or Calvin. The man in the chair says, but only he can do it. You mean Calvin and I can't know who you really are? Oh, I didn't say that. Bottom of 142. You can't know it in the same way. Nor is it as important to me to have you know. In other words, yeah, you can know, but not in the same way, and it doesn't serve my purposes to have you know. Okay? So, they sit there, they talk about the food that is given and such. Page 144. Charles Wallace manages, to take a bite of the food. Meg says, turkey. He swallows it. It says, tastes like sand. So why does it taste like sand to him, but turkey to her?
Because he's kind of blocking out the signals the man with the red eyes is putting out to make it taste like what it's supposed to taste like.
He's seen through the illusion. See, the appearance of the food is an illusion. The taste of the food is an illusion. He tastes it for what it really is. It's like sand. And so he asks, why? You know perfectly well why. You've shut your mind entirely to me. The other two can't. That is, even though they haven't looked into his eyes, he controls what they're thinking. I can get in through the chinks, not all the way in, but enough to give them a turkey dinner. You see, I'm really just a kind, jolly old gentleman. Kind, jolly old gentleman kind of suggests, ooh.
Santa Claus.
Yeah. All right. So Charles Wallace asks, can I talk to Megan Calvin without you listening in? No. So he tells them, 145. I have to find out who he really is. You know that. I'm going to try to hold back. I'm going to try to keep part of myself out. You mustn't stop me this time, Meg. But you won't be able to, Charles. He's stronger than you are. You know that. I have to try. But Mrs. Whatsit warned you. I have to try. And he does what? He pulls his ace out. For father, Meg. This is for Dad. But it isn't only Father, Meg. You know that now. It's the black thing. The black thing they tessered through. Okay? We have to do what Mrs. Witch sent us to do. Meg begs Calvin. He says he's right. Okay? So, Charles Wallace does look into his eyes and digs into dinner. Why? Because now what he said before tasted like sand is now turkey and dressing as though it were the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. Okay? Chapter 8. He was dressed like Charles Wallace. He looked like Charles Wallace. He had the same hair and everything, but it's not Charles Wallace. And he finally speaks to Meg and says, page 148, we've been all wrong. He isn't an enemy. He's our friend. Calvin, nuts. You don't understand, Calvin. Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, Mrs. Which have confused us. They're the ones who are really our enemies. Meg says no. Okay. Calvin's holding on to Charles Wallace. And Meg cries out for Mrs. Whatsit. Help, Obi-Wan Kenobi kind of a thing. She doesn't come. So he says, page 150, Meg, just listen. We've been all wrong, I tell you. We haven't understood. We've been fighting our friend and Father's friend. If Father tells me he's our friend, maybe I'll believe it. That is, where's Father? Let Father tell me that. I think Father's under a spell or something. This isn't fairy tales, Meg. Spells, indeed. If you just relax, you'd realize all our troubles are over. You don't understand what a wonderful place we've come to. What does he mean? You see, on this planet, everything is in perfect order because everybody has learned to relax, to give in, to submit. All you have to do is look quietly and steadily into the eyes of our good friend here, for he is our friend, dear sister, and he will take you in as he has taken me. What does that mean? He will take you in. He will control you. He will dupe you. He will trick you. Okay? Calvin says, if you are our friend, tell us who or what you really are. Not necessary for you to know that. Page 151. I'm the prime coordinator. That's all you need to know. But you're being spoken through, just like Charles Wallace. Are you hypnotized too? He says that's a primitive word. Let's not use primitive words. Okay? So, they're moving on along down a corridor, page 152, and Meg remembers something. Do you remember what Mrs. Whatsit said your gift was? Communication. And that was what she was giving you? She says, we've been trying to fight Charles physically. That's not any good. Can you try to communicate with him? How? Either up here or via words. Okay? So Calvin's like, hey, you're right. So he sidles up next to Charles Wallace. Charles Wallace, leave me alone. I'm not going to hurt you, old sport. Just trying to be friendly. Let's make it up, huh? Oh, you mean you're coming around? Sure, we're being reasonable. Look at me for a minute. He does. Calvin looks back, and page 153, and Meg could feel the intensity of his concentration. And Charles Wallace shudders. Why?
Because like the old Charles Wallace is starting to come back. But
okay, because Calvin almost breaks through. Charles Wallace, I should have known better. If you want to see Murray, you better come with me. Don't try any more hanky-panky. Notice, Murray, not father. Charles, what's a father? Merely another misconception. If you feel the need of a father, then I would suggest that you turn to it. Who's this it? Meg asks. All in good time. You're not ready for it yet. First, I will tell you something about this beautiful, enlightened planet of Camazotz. Okay, so what's been their experience so far of this beautiful, enlightened planet?
Everybody's the same. They all do the same things, have all this paperwork, and it sucks. Okay.
Everybody acts the same. Everybody behaves the same. Everybody plays the same. Everybody dresses the same. And if they don't, what happens?
They get taken away.
Or they get written up and then taken away. He says, perhaps you do not realize that on Camazotz we have conquered all illness, all deformity. Calvin, we? Who's the we? Charles Wallace ignores him. We let no one suffer. Well, that sounds good, right? Suffering's bad. Illness is bad. Pain's bad. We let no one suffer. It is so much kinder simply to annihilate anyone who is ill. So you get cold, you get sick, we just take you out.
Take you out, pack, shoot you in the head.
Nobody has weeks and weeks of runny noses, sore throats. Rather than endure such discomfort, they are simply put to sleep.
Get
Calvin.
the common cold, you get...
Yeah, Calvin, you mean they're murdered? Murder is such a primitive word. No such thing as murder. It takes care of all such things. Okay? They get to a wall, and the wall disappears. Calvin, how'd you do that? Do what? Make the wall open like that? Rearrange the atoms? Come on, Calvin, you're smart. You know about atomics, about physics, right? Every atom is more what than what?
Empty space.
It's more empty space than matter. So he says, I just moved empty space. Page 155. On Camazotz, we are all happy. Why? Because we are all alike. Differences create problems. You know that, don't you, dear sister? Look at what's been going on in the United States for the last couple of years. White lives matter, black lives matter, yellow lives matter. White supremacy marches, Antifa marches, Occupy Wall Street marches, marches here, marches there, this book being banned from that classroom because somebody's offended by it, this classroom being taken over by students because somebody's offended by it. Differences create chaos, right? Meg, no. Oh, yes, you do. You've seen at home how true it is. You know that's the reason you're not happy at school. Why? Because you were different. Just as Charles Wallace is different. Calvin, I'm different. I'm happy. But you pretend you aren't different. I'm different, and I like being different. Meg, maybe I don't like being different, but I don't want to be like somebody else or everybody else either. She says, I wish I could be somebody else, but she doesn't specify a somebody else. She wishes she had her mother's looks, but she doesn't want to be her mother. All right? Notice what Charles Wallace has said. We're all happy because we're all alike. That's why they're all happy. They're all the same. There's no originality, no uniqueness on Camazotz. So, Meg asked again, so what's this it? Page 156. You might call it the boss. It sometimes calls itself the happiest, saddest. Meg, I don't know what you're talking about. So he spells it out. That's S-A-D-I-S-T, not S-A-D-D-E-S-T. You know, lots of people mispronounce it. Lots of people say sadist. Meg, I don't care. I don't want to see it. Meg, you're supposed to have some mind. Why do you think we have wars at home? Why do you think people get confused and unhappy? Because they all live their own separate individual lives. Been trying to explain to you in the simplest possible way. On Camazotz, individuals have been done away with. Camazotz is one mind. It is, in the classic sense, a collective. Like Soviet communism or North Korean communism or any kind of real communism. Why? Why is it a collective? Because all of us, we're just the worker bees working for who's ever at the top. And it's a collective because everything we do in this kind of society goes where?
To the government.
Do I keep it?
No.
No. It goes to the government. And then the government does what? It apportions it out. Okay?
But the most for themselves.
Yeah, mostly for themselves. Look at North Korea. Perfect example of a communist state. Who has everything? Who has nothing? Kim Jong-un has everything. The people out in the cities have nothing. That's why they're all starving. So, he calls the three tramp ladies witches. Meg, she's not a witch. No. Calvin, no. You know she's not. It's just their game. That is, that's what they, what?
Want people to think of them as.
That's their illusion. See, just like it creates illusions, they create illusions. Charles Wallace. They want us to go on being confused instead of properly organized. Organized. They want us to be what? Individuals rather than like ants. All working for a single common good. Meg, I know our world isn't perfect, Charles, but it's better than this. This isn't the only alternative. Can't be. Nobody suffers. Nobody's ever unhappy. Notice what it is promising.
An end to unhappiness.
An end to unhappiness. No pain, no suffering, no sorrow. Sounds like what?
Paradise.
Paradise. Heaven. No tears. No hunger.
The summer lands.
Yeah, man. I mean, this is heaven. Nobody suffers, nobody's ever unhappy, Meg, but nobody's ever happy either. See, the opposite of being unhappy is not happy. Maybe if you aren't unhappy, sometimes you don't know how to be happy. And she tells Calvin, I want to go home. What does that mean? Calvin, let's leave. Charles Wallace is going to stay. Calvin, we can't leave Charles. And we can't go before we find your father. You know that, but you're right, Meg. And Mrs. Witch is right. This is evil. Why is it evil? What is it denying?
Freedom.
Freedom? What's freedom based on?
Free thinking.
Individuality. See? Individuality. You hear all kinds of talk today about building relationships and what comes as a result of that? Building community and everybody getting along wonderfully. But you only have a community of what? Individuals. You got to have the individuals first, okay, before you can do that. But there's no individuals here. It's everybody shares the same mind. So they see the column. She sees her father. She runs to the column. And she gets in to the column. And we're told, page 162, Charles Wallace says to Meg, you want to save your father? You must do as I have done and go into it. No, you don't really want to save your father. In other words, you don't really love your father. How will my being a zombie save father? It wants you and it will get you. Don't forget that I too am now a part of it. You know I wouldn't have done it if it weren't the right thing to do. Why? Because Charles Wallace always does the right thing. But Calvin's not paying any attention to Meg or Charles Wallace. Excuse me, he's paying all of his attention to Charles Wallace. He stares into the pale blue that was all that was left of Charles Wallace's eyes. And he thinks of what? He thinks of the words that Mrs. Witch gave him. The lines from The Tempest. And for thou wast the spirit too delicate to act her earthly and abhorred commands, she did confine thee into a cloven pine. And he suddenly understands. He looks at Charles Wallace and says, you're like Ariel. You are bound in the cloven pine, Charles, and I can let you out. I know how to release you. Calvin, come back, Charles. Come back to us. And he shudders again. And then it was as an invisible hand had smacked against the chest, knocked him to the ground. And the stare with which Calvin had held him was broken. So Meg says, try father. She says, isn't father the same? And Meg remembers the spectacles. Takes off the spectacles. She goes through the column. She's hugging her father. She's holding her father. 165. Now there's just peace, comfort leaning against him. And she says, we got to go get Charles Wallace quickly. And he's like, I can't leave here. He puts the glasses on. He goes out. He comes back in. He says, Meg, you got to get on my back. Okay? So they go out from the column now. So you have Meg, Calvin, Mr. Murray, looking at Charles Wallace, who's just standing there, tapping his foot because he's impatient. And he says, it is not pleased, page 169. And Mr. Murray says, Charles Wallace, what do you want? I'm your father, look at me. Hi, Pop. Meg, it's not him, Father. How well does his father know him?
Not at all.
He left when he was a baby, okay? So he tries to issue commands. Commands mean nothing. And they get taken to it, 174. You're in this room. There's a desk or table. And it is on it, a brain. A disembodied brain. She looks at Charles Wallace. He stands there looking at it, his jaw hanging kind of loose. She looks at her father. He shouts to Calvin, "Don't give in." He says, "I won't. Help Meg." Okay? What is it trying to do to them? It's using this repetitive rhythm to draw them in. In page 176, Meg's thinking, what did Ms. What's-it give me? She said, "Meg, I give you your faults." Well, what are her greatest faults? Anger, impatience, stubbornness. And so she turns to these. And as it keeps working on her, she starts to think of things that don't work. Georgie, Georgie, pudding and pie, kissed the girls and made them cry. No, there's rhythm to that. She needs something that'll break the rhythm. We hold these truths to be self-evident, bottom of 176, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Okay? She feels it seizing her brain. But that's exactly what we have on Camazotz. Complete equality. All men are created equal. But that's what we have, complete equality. See, we don't have complete equality, do we? We have, according to Jefferson, equality of worth. That is, we are of equal value. Do we have equality of ability? No, we don't. At all. Meg, like and equal are not the same thing. Because it says everybody exactly alike. Her father, "Good girl, Meg." Like and equal are not, good girl. In Camazotz, all are equal. In Camazotz, everybody is the same as everybody else. So notice what that means. If somebody goes missing, it doesn't really matter. There's somebody else to fill in your spot. Right? So, Calvin tells Mr. Murray he has to test her. They've got to get out of there. So they do. Chapter 10. And Meg wakes up. She can't move. She can't do anything. But she hears Calvin and her father talking. Right? And they keep talking for a long time. And she hears them but can't let them know. She's aware. And Mr. Murray says on 185, he realizes something. And he needs to tell the others, meaning the men in the government. I have to tell the others, we know nothing. Calvin, what do you mean? Just what I say. We're children playing with dynamite. In our mad rush, we've plunged into this before. Dash. What's he mean? What's the before? What have they plunged into before knowing nothing? The Manhattan Project? The development of nuclear weapons? Yeah, I think it's that. Right? He's saying, we're playing with something we don't understand. What's the something they don't understand?
Tessering.
Tessering. Time travel. And we now have physicists who say, even though Einstein says it ain't possible, we do have physicists who say it theoretically is possible.
Or at least...
Should we?
Probably not.
Okay. So, Meg comes back, and she wants to know, why did we leave? Why did we leave Charles Wallace? Page 189. It was taking us. You and I were slipping. If your father had gone on trying to help us, he wouldn't have been able to hold out much longer. You told him to test her. Mr. Murray, there isn't any question of blame. Can you move? Now all Meg's faults are uppermost in her. meaning she's ready to blow. All her anger, all her impatience, etc. Disappointment was as dark and corrosive in her as the black thing. The ugly words tumbled from her cold lips, even as she herself could not believe it was to her father. Why? What did she expect would happen when she found her father?
That everything would be all right.
Daddy would solve all the problems. And instead, he's made it worse. She has him, but now she doesn't have her little brother, who she is closest to in the world. Okay? He bends over her, page 190. He's massaging her fingers. Why? He's getting her blood to move more regularly because she's still cold to the touch. And he says, I am not a Mrs. What's-it, a Mrs. Who, or a Mrs. Which. Yeah, Calvin told me what he could. I am a human being and a very fallible one. So they aren't? No, they aren't. What do we find out they are later on? Guardian angels. We were sent here for something. We know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. What? He just starts quoting the book of Romans. But he's not quoting the book of Romans. He's just speaking about it like that's everyday, ordinary thought for him and his family. Meg's like, the black thing, you almost let it get me. You've never tested as well as the rest of us, Calvin reminded her. Didn't bother Charles and me before like it did you. So whatever the black thing is, it affects her more than it does the others. Okay? So these other figures, creatures come, and Aunt Beast takes Meg. For what purpose?
The healer.
To heal her. Page 201. She's just holding Meg, kind of cradling her with her various tentacles and stuff. And Meg is initially at peace. And Meg, but Father left him. Bottom of 201. He's got to bring him back. He can't just abandon Charles Wallace. Nobody said anything about abandoning anybody. That is not our way. But we know that just because we want something does not mean that we will get what we want. And we still do not know what to do. It's a kind of polite way of saying, Meg, grow up. And we cannot allow you in your present state to do anything that would jeopardize us all. In other words, and you have got to be taken care of so you don't hurt anybody else. Okay? So, 205, skipping a bit. Meg goes for a long sleep. She wakes up and Meg's like, oh, I feel wonderful. Like sleep, sauna, massage, everything all rolled into one. Okay? Meg asks Aunt Beast, are you fighting the black thing? Yes. Doing that, we can never relax. We are the called according to his purpose. And whom he calls, them he also justifies. Again, quoting St. Paul. Meg, who helps you? Oh, I can't explain that. She says, the other two are as hard to reach into as you are. Here's what I can tell you. What can I tell you that will mean anything to you? Good helps us. The stars help us. Perhaps what you would call light helps us. Love helps us. She goes, I can't explain. You'll just have to know it or not know it. But we look not at the things which are what you would call seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. She's quoting 2 Corinthians. Meg, do you know Mrs. What's-it? In other words, you two kind of remind me of each other. Mrs. What's-it? I don't understand your language. Would you like me to take you to your father and Calvin? Yes, please. She goes, and we're told, page 207, While she had been in Aunt Beast's arms, Meg had felt safe and secure. Now, her worries about Charles Wallace and her disappointment in her father's human fallibility rose like gorge in her throat, like she's going to vomit. She says, I'm fine. Calvin, Meg, you got to come eat this, okay? So, I'm going to skip a bunch. Mrs. Whatsit shows up. Okay? And says, page 210, the three of them actually show up. This wasn't 210. This wasn't Mrs. Whatsit or Mrs. Who or Mrs. Which. She might as well have described Mrs. Whatsit as she was when she took on the form of a flying creature of Uriel. Aunt B says, don't try to use words. You're just fighting yourself and me. Think about what they are. Meg tries again, but she can't. Calvin does it. Angels. Guardian angels. Messengers. Messengers of God. And a tall, thin beast says, how strange it is that they can't tell us what they themselves seem to know. Okay? And we hear this, we are here. So, they talk to Mrs. Whatsit, and Mr. Murray says, I've got to go back and get Charles. She says, you can't. Calvin says, I'll go back and get him. She says, you can't. 2:14. No, Calvin. Charles has gone even deeper into it. You will not be permitted to throw yourself in with him. For that, you must realize is what would happen. No one speaks. There's silence. Because notice, Meg doesn't go, I'll go. In the faint light, that must be Mrs. Witch. No one spoke. One of the beasts moved a tendril slowly back and forth. Meg could stand it no longer. Then what are you going to do? That is, if Father won't go and Calvin won't go, what are you going to do? Are you just going to throw Charles away? Silence, child. And they're silent. Silence, and Meg presses up against Aunt Beast. Goes, I can't go. I can't. You know I can't. Why did she say that? Did anybody ask you to? Because the silence is deafening. She burst into tears. Okay, I'll go. I know you want me to. We want nothing from you that you do without grace. That is, that you do without some kind of gift of power. Or that you do without understanding. Meg, but I do understand. Why can't it be Calvin?
Because he doesn't really know Charles all that well.
Charles Wallace barely knows him. Why can't it be his father?
Same reason.
Because he doesn't know him. Meg? Closest one to him. What do you understand? Mrs. Witch says. It has to be me. I understand. I don't understand Charles, but he understands me. I'm the one who's closest to him. If it had been longer, that is, if Calvin had known Charles longer, then he could have. Yes?
So earlier you said something about how Calvin and Charles, were somewhat alike. Calvin was not quite as much
Right.
like Charles. And I imagine that by being his father, Mr. Murray is also somewhat like Charles. Would that have anything to do with?
A little bit, but he's like Charles in the way that Mrs. Murray is like Charles.
Right.
She doesn't do what Charles Wallace can do. For example, when in the beginning of the book, when Meg comes down to the kitchen that evening, Charles Wallace says, I knew you would come. Okay, what it means within the context of the book is that's not just a hunch. He knows Meg is coming. Okay, Mrs. Murray doesn't do that with Charles or with Meg. Mr. Murray doesn't do that. We're going to be told next book that that is what's called kithing. It's essentially the ability to read minds or to know what somebody else is thinking or planning on doing. Okay? Charles Wallace has that in spades with certain people. He has that with Meg. He has that with Calvin. He has that to some extent with his mother. Calvin can do this some. His compulsion that he talked about, how sometimes he just knows where to be, knows what to do, it's related to this, okay? But he can't be the one to go get him because he doesn't know him well enough. That's why Meg says here, if Calvin had known him longer, like a year, he would be the one to go, okay? But there's still something that Calvin doesn't have that Meg does have that she comes to understand later, okay? So, she says, I'll go. Calvin and Mr. Murray are not very supportive of this idea. Page 218, 219. Calvin asks, well, can't Meg know what's going to happen? That is, can't you give her assurance that she will succeed? Well, not in this kind of thing. If we knew ahead of time what was going to happen, we'd be like the people in Camazotz, right? You put the ball down, you automatically know what's going to happen. You send your kid out, what do you know? Kid from door 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, they're all going to bounce the balls at exactly the same time. Kids at houses 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, they're all going to jump rope in time. No. We'd be like the people on Camazotz with no lives of our own, with everything all planned and done for us. How can I explain it? Oh, I know how. A sonnet. Calvin's the guy who's good with words. What's a sonnet? It's a 14-line poem, has a very specific meter, has a very specific rhyme structure. Okay? Calvin's like, and this is relevant how? Page 219 towards the bottom. Oh, do not be stupid, boy. You know perfectly well. You're comparing our lives to a sonnet. Okay. Strict form, but freedom within it. Yes. You're given the form. But you have to write the sonnet you say. You have to write the sonnet yourself. What you say in the sonnet is completely up to you. Where are we? We're back at Heaven the Smith, Dwivik the Weaver, and Law Clay Shaper. Life is the form. What we do inside that life, total freedom. Okay? So, Meg goes off. But just before she does, Mrs. Who tells her, quotes scripture again, page 222, listen, Meg, listen well. In other words, if you've never been to church before, Meg, you better listen now. But I think the implication is, by the fact that her father quotes scripture, they probably have. The foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For ye see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And base things of the world and things which are despised hath God chosen, yea, and things which are not, to bring to naught things that are. What in the world is Paul talking about? Go back to the beginning. Foolishness of God is wiser than men. Weakness of God is stronger than men. What's the weakness of God? The cross. Right? Instrument of torture and death. The most despised form of death in the Roman Empire becomes what?
The symbol of Christianity.
The symbol of Christianity. Okay? When Christ gets ready to go to the cross, he says, now am I glorified. What does he mean? He doesn't mean, hey, look at me as I really am. Second person of the Trinity. He means here. Hanging here on the cross. Wisdom of men? What does that look like? Loser. They won. You lost. That's not wise. That's stupid. Okay? So the foolishness of God, this, is more powerful than men and such. But what is this symbolic of? What is it emblematic of?
Sacrifice.
John 3:16. You seen it, professional athletes, have it written on their faces and stuff. For God so loved the world. That's it, right there. It's love. We tend to use this as the symbol of love today. With fat little cherubs, doing things. This, okay? So what has she just been told?
That love is the strongest.
Love, Meg. Love is more powerful than wisdom, okay? And then Mrs. Witch says, before you go, I got to give you my gift. Haven't given you my gift. 2:23. I have not given you my gift. You have something that it has not. This something is your only weapon, but you must find it for yourself. And she's like, great, thanks. What does that mean? So she goes off. And she sees Charles Wallace, 2:27, and yet it's not Charles Wallace. What is it I have got that it hasn't got? Well, it has got Charles Wallace, so it can't be that. And Charles Wallace says, you have nothing that it hasn't got. Notice, he reads her mind. How nice to have you back, dear sister. We've been waiting for you. We knew that Mrs. Watson would send you. She's our friend, And Meg's thinking, liar. As long as she can stay angry, she's thinking, I can stay out of its clutches. Is that what I have that it hasn't got? Anger? Hatred? Nonsense. You have nothing that it doesn't have. Notice he doesn't say, you have nothing that I don't have. Why not?
Because he's not thinking of himself. He's thinking of the collective vision.
Really close. He's not yet it. Charles Wallace isn't yet totally gone. Okay? 2:28, she's thinking. Hate was nothing that it didn't have. It knew all about hate. She says, you're lying about that. And you're lying about Mrs. Watson. Mrs. Watson hates you. And that's where it makes its mistake. If Meg knows anything, she knows what?
Mrs. Watson.
Mrs. Watson loves her. Aunt Beast loves her, etc. Mrs. Watson loves me. That's what she told me, that she loves me. In it clicks. She knew. Love. That's what she had that it did not have. She had Mrs. Watson's love for her father's love, her mother's love, the real Charles Wallace's love, the twins' love, Aunt Beast's love, and she loves them back. Okay, so how can I use love? Can you form love into a weapon? This is love, baby. Kind of hard. But she could love Charles Wallace. She could stand there and she could love Charles Wallace. But this isn't Charles Wallace, right? Mm-hmm. It's his body, but it's not him. Her own Charles Wallace and the real Charles Wallace, the child for whom she had come back to Camazotz. What does she do when she comes back to Camazotz? What is she doing?
Thinking of Charles Wallace.
Okay, keep going. Think this. She's sacrificing herself. She is willingly going where?
To it.
To it. Okay? What happens if she fails?
She'll become one with
She
it.
becomes part of the Borg. She could love Charles Wallace. And so she thinks, Charles, I love you, my baby brother, who always takes care of me. Come back to me, Charles Wallace. Come away from it. Come back, come home. I love you, Charles. Oh, Charles Wallace, I love you. Tears streaming down her cheeks. She can't even look at him. And she keeps thinking that. Slowly his mouth closes. Why? Because his mouth's just kind of been open. Like he's watched TV for 18 hours. And, all the nerves just kind of... And he's just... His eyes stop twirling. The tick in the forehead, the little muscle stops twitching. And he starts to walk towards her. I love you, she cries. I love you, Charles. I love you. And suddenly he runs. Meg, Meg, Meg. You did it, Meg. And he says, I love you, I love you, I love you. And she says that back. And they test her back. Calvin says, you did it. And we're told, 232. Meg knew all at once that Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which must be near. Why? Because all through her, she felt a flooding of joy and of love that was even greater and deeper than the joy and love which were already there. What is the joy and love which were already there? Where are they at that point?
Back on Earth.
They're back at the house. So that Mrs. Murray has come out, seen her husband who's been gone for a while. The twins have come out. Father, is it really you? You know, the dog's there wagging its tail and everything. In other words, you have a reunified family that has been split and broken. Now, back as it should be. But it's more than just that. There is something else. Okay? And the three have to disappear. And we're not told where. Now, when you leave this one and pick up the next one, it sounds like only a year has passed by. Because Charles Wallace is in his first year of school. And yet, here it sounds like, they're learning the basics of time travel and such. And in the next one, we're going to be told at one point, men have already been landed on Mars. And yet we know that by 1972 or so, when that book was written, men haven't been landed on Mars. How do we know? Because we still haven't gone to Mars. We put a bunch of robots and stuff on it. Okay? So when is it set? Not really sure. Okay? All right, we'll stop there. Expect a quiz, because I want to try to build up a few extra quizzes so I can drop